Hey, welcome to House Church, and man, I love being with you for this 9-minute message. And today we're in a series called The Way of Jesus, and I've loved this series. It's been convicting to me, but really what we've done with it is we've come back and kind of given you 7 different marks, 7 different qualities, 7 different things that we see in Jesus' life and that we see in the early church. And we've asked you to kind of ask yourself, is that a part of your life? Like if we've been studying the way of Jesus, is this a part of your way? Is this a part of your rhythm? And I want to be honest with you, last week was difficult for me because last week we talked about life rhythms. And I was convicted, y'all. When I took the assessment, you've done this on the app and you've kind of gotten the results, hopefully by now. Man, I score okay until it gets to life rhythms. And so last week was difficult for me. This week, I think for you is going to be encouraging. This week, we're talking about intentional community. And listen, before we even get there, we've got to pause because many of the people I'm speaking to right now are living in intentional community. I mean, look around. A lot of you are in a living room right now. Look around. Right now, you're in a circle. There's different ages. There's different backgrounds. There's people you've just met, and you're beginning to live in community. Some of you are watching online. Some of you are listening. Maybe you haven't taken that step yet. But for many of us, man, we've come so far when it comes to living in community, and I just got to say, way to go. For you to be where you are, for our church to be where we are when it comes to community, man, we've come so far. But I think we can go farther. And so today, I'm going to give you a few things that I see when I begin to study and when I begin to think about biblical, intentional community, what it takes to get us there, or maybe what it takes for us to go a step farther in that direction, okay? Last week, Jeff introduced this passage to you. We read from Acts 2, and this is the beginning of the early church. And when you read Acts 2, particularly when you get to verse 42 through 47, man, you're just in awe the way they lived together and what it looked like. And so the first thing, when it comes to intentional biblical community, for us to take a next step, you got to understand you can't just show up and sign up for community. I mean, I wish you could, right? That would be so easy. If you could just kind of sign up, say you're going to be there, show up, it starts, it leaves, you go home, and that be it. And there's just these deep, rich relationships, and you know that's not true. That's why when you look at verse 42 in Acts 2, it says, they devoted themselves. That's a serious word. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship. And I started thinking about the context of that. Like this group of believers, these were the same people that had just put Jesus on the cross. I mean, these were the people that had just chosen for him to be killed. I mean, they betrayed Jesus. And now they've experienced the Holy Spirit and God has moved. And Peter said just earlier in that chapter that they needed to repent and then to be baptized. And now he's describing their life. I mean, this was a checkered group of people that were now coming together. And in the early church, at this season of the movement of Christ, the way of Jesus, they were feeling oppression. I mean, it wasn't the popular thing. This wasn't easy. They needed each other. They were desperate to have other people in this journey with them. I mean, they would share the things they were up against. They would share the poverty they were facing. They would share the persecution they were feeling. I mean, they were devoted to meeting each other's needs because, man, God had done a work in their life, and we need to be devoted. It's different in our day. I get it, man, right? People kind of describe the Southern culture we live in and church almost like a buffet where we can get a little from this church, we can get a little from that church, we can jump over here to this church, and that's okay. I mean, listen, I've sent my kids to other churches for VBS. I've shown up at different retreats. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we're going to go deeper in our house churches, then we've got to be devoted to one another, even when it's raining. I mean, really, think about it. Like, even when maybe you don't feel like it, we've got to lean in. I started thinking about what are the words to kind of help you measure that. And I think the first thing is time. I mean, we got to be willing to give each other time. Today, before I got here to film this, I was at the courthouse, and it wasn't a speeding ticket. I was at the courthouse because it was the finalization of an adoption. And this was a couple that was in a house church, and man, they're standing there, and around them this morning at 9 o'clock at Perry County was their house church. It wasn't Wednesday night, wasn't Sunday morning, but they were willing to give their time because they knew, man, we've got to spend time with one another, getting to know each other and stand in the gap with one another. We've got to be available to build a deeper sense of community. I was reading this morning in Acts 16, and I was reading about Paul and Silas and the way they spread the gospel, and finally they get a moment to rest, and it was Sunday, and he went down to the river. He headed down to the Okatoma, to Little Black Creek to rest, and there's Lydia. And man, Paul made himself available. Then they get put in jail, and what happens? They share the gospel with the jailer. Listen, that's one of the things we've got to do. We've got to make ourselves available to one another. I got a house church that last semester, they spent their Friday night at one of their high schoolers' football games. Why? Because it was their time to stand in the gap. It was their time to be available to the young man that was in their group. I think for us to go a little bit deeper in our house churches, it's going to require sacrifice. Paul and Silas, Acts chapter 16, talked about them being available, but they also had to sacrifice their bodies. And they were beaten. They were thrown in jail. I don't know that you're going to face that today, but I do think there's a reality for us to go kind of farther. We've got to invest a little bit more. We've got to sacrifice a little bit. For me, I'll tell you what that looked like last night. After we got off work, before we took the boys to soccer practice, we made lasagna. More lasagna than I would ever want to make again, right? Those boys left there in their soccer uniforms, and every one of them smelled like ground meat. But I'm going to ask you something. Are you sacrificing for your group? Are you willing to pitch in a little bit when it comes to money for whatever a need is? Are you willing to say, hey, listen, let me speak into the kids this week. Kids, parents, if you're in your group, I need to say this so clearly. Your child is not a distraction. They're not an interruption. Relax. We're sacrificing for one another because you never forget the people in your life that sacrificed for you. Man, it means so much to you when someone gives up their time, when someone makes themselves available. And when someone says, listen, I may not be in the season with young kids, but this is my turn to love your children and to encourage you. So the first thing we got to do is we got to be devoted. The second thing I think I see, community requires fellowship. Do you see how he said that in Acts 2? He says they were devoted to one another, to the apostles' teaching, and to fellowship. Paul said it this way, and this is one of my favorite verses. I love this in 1 Thessalonians 2:8. He says, we loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel, okay, there's the teaching, but we got to share our lives with you. I mean, don't you love that, to begin to think about what that looked like for them? They were so dear to them. You had become so dear to us, we couldn't help but share our lives with you. Listen, we need that desperately, man. You can't turn this on and off. You can't kind of show up an hour before the message in a big white room in a big building that's not your own and just walk in and sit in a chair and walk out when the bell rings or when the message starts. No, it's deeper. Like they had become dear. I mean, they had become personal friends. This wasn't just a program. This was life. This was the way Jesus lived his life. Man, there was moments like this where he taught, for sure. We talked about it last week, where they came to the temples, but Jesus didn't live under the stage. Jesus didn't preach and leave. Jesus didn't ghost the people closest to him. No, he gave of his life. He gave of his time. He was available. He went house to house, and that's what we're doing. That's what you're doing tonight. But I think it requires fellowship. I wish it was just content. I mean, I'm doing a 9-minute message. This is content. It hurts my feelings to say that content's not enough, but it takes community. Content is no substitution for community. Gosh, man, I love the little things we can do to give you little one-liners, and it hurts my feelings to go there, but this is not where real life change happens just with information. It happens in relationship. Think about the baptism stories. There's nothing I love more on a Sunday morning than when I get to be a part of baptism. And I love to watch it because so often I won't hear a thing about content. Instead, I'll hear so-and-so invited me. So-and-so invested in me. My wife modeled this. My husband taught this. Hebrews 10:24-25 says this, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, one another. Let us not give up meeting together, as some in the habit of doing, but let us encourage who? One another. Listen, that's the blueprint for what we're doing. That's the ABCs of community. The A is accountability. Did you hear where he said? They said, we're spurring one another on. The B is belonging. Man, we're giving you a sense of belonging right here in this living room tonight. And the C is, man, we're going to care for you. They were caring for each other. Listen, this is Bible doing. Listen, we're going to keep Bible studying. That's a part of weekly worship. You're going to hear the word, and you've got the Bible reading plan on your phone. But there comes a moment when we take the next step and we begin to Bible do. It's an action. We begin to take care of one another. We begin to encourage one another. Galatians 6 says it this way. It says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, man, restore that person. That's what we want to do in our circles, in our living rooms. We want to restore each other, carry each other. Carry each other's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. The third thing, the last thing is authentic community requires restoring and carrying each other's burdens. Listen, this series has gotten us back to the way of Jesus. And I want to tell you, one of the things I'm realizing is you are never more of a partner. You are never more a part of what we're doing or a part of the movement or the way of Jesus than when you are gently restoring others and then when you are carrying each other's burdens. James goes a step farther. He says, and when you are praying for one another. Listen, it's not about a sticker. It's not about an aisle that you can walk. It's not even about a membership class you can go to. You are more a part of what we're doing when you are carrying someone's burdens, when you are restoring them, when you're in fellowship with them, and when you're praying for them because, oh my goodness, you are devoted to relationships. Listen, Revelation 3 says it this way, and this is the last thing. It says it a little more boldly than we've said it today. It says, wake up. It says, wake up, church. Listen, I feel like that's where we are. I want you to know this. I believe we are woke. I believe there are things happening in 50 different house churches tonight that are amazing. But I want to challenge you. Would you go one step farther when it comes to living an intentional, biblical community? You can do it.